So, welcome everyone this evening to the last in the series of questions in history delivered by the history team here at York St John University. I'm Dr. Christopher Price. I'm a senior lecturer in history and I'm chairing tonight's session. But at the start of the show is Dr. Alice Brumby, my colleague, who you also see in the picture. Alice is an academic specialist in the history of mental health, and we'll be delivering tonight's paper, which is entitled Were 19th Century Asylums, Hospitals or Prisons? So the title of tonight's paper, Were 19th Century Asylums, Hospitals or Prisons? Alice, as I said, has a strong publication record in the field, but if she looks familiar to you, you might have seen her recently on the David Williams episode of Who Do You Think You Are? Appearing as an expert witness. So we're in safe hands this evening. I should just say that you can you can ask questions throughout in the Q&A session of the page. And if there are questions for Alice, I'll read through them and we can deliver them at the end. There'll be a short Q&A session at the end of the paper. And Alice will field questions. There might well be far too many to deal with in the time available, but Alice will leave her email address on screen at the end of the paper. So if you wish to continue dialogue with Alice, then you can ask questions of her via the university email address. One other thing to say is that captions are automatically on, but you can hover over the screen, and on the live transcript, looks like two C's at the bottom of the screen, you can turn captions on and off according to will. And I think the last thing to say is that particularly happy to be delivering this paper quite fittingly in Mental Health Awareness Week. So without further ado, that's enough talking from me, and I'll go over straight to Alice to deliver tonight's paper.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to everybody for coming tonight. It's so sad because I can't see you, and it'd be nice to have this conversation with you all in the room together. I gather there's quite a few of you listening, and that for me, that is testimony to things that are changing, and I'm so pleased about that. So, as you may know, as Chris has already told us, it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week. And basically, I wanted to give this talk today to basically start a conversation. I'm a historian and I'm absolutely passionate about history. But I also want to use history. I want us to know about history because I want to use it to learn from it. So entitling my talk tonight, Were 19th Century Asylums, Hospitals or Prisons? What I want to do is I want to engage in a discussion. I want to engage in a discussion about the past, but also about today. And I'd be interested to hear your comments and questions in the chat later. So I think there's lots of evidence that suggests that some of the things that we find absolutely barbaric today were considered to be helpful treatments in the past. And that leads me to thinking, well, if that's true for the past, then what are we doing today that might be considered to be barbaric in 100 or 200 years' time? So, just to frame my question and this lecture, this talk for you then, I want us to think about various things in this talk. I'm going to start by thinking about changing spaces of care throughout history in mental illness. And then I want us to focus on the 19th century legislation. We'll have a little bit of a think about contested histories. So why the number of asylums grow to such an extent in the 19th century. In order to do that, I want to make this talk personal. So I want to think about, well, who was sent there and why? And what were life and treatments like for the patients that ended up in these institutions? Before I start though, I really want to mention terminology here. This talk and tonight I'm going to use language that we consider to be incorrect and offensive today. I don't want to do this to upset people, and that's by no means why I'm doing it. I'm going to use these words because they're words with a medical and a legal context. They're words that are inescapable in the 19th century. And so when I use words such as lunatic and such as asylum, I'm using those words in the historical context that they were meant in. So to begin my talk then, my talk today is going to focus very much on the 19th century. But I thought before I did this, it makes some sense to share some of the wider context of care with you. So one of the things that we know about mental health care is that there's been a real mixed approach to care over the centuries. There's been different levels and different spaces of treatment. Mental health has a long and varied history in this country. So the first institution, you probably already know this, so give yourselves a brownie point. The first institution for caring for the mentally ill in this country dates back to 1247 and was of course Bethlehem Hospital. Some of you may have heard it through different names. It got given different nicknames during the years. It's frequently referred to as Bedlam. If you've ever used or more frequently heard a school teacher use the phrase, "It's like Bedlam in here," that's the longer understanding of the term. Now, despite this, I think it's very important to suggest that institutional treatment, so this kind of institutional treatment like at Bedlam, was exceptionally rare. And actually most patients, most people during this period are treated at home within their families and within their communities. There was really little to no understanding about mental illness. Treatments were harsh and illnesses were often perceived in a kind of religious context. Moving on from then, what we start to see is a change in provision in the 18th century. So the 18th century starts to see the growth in small scale care for mental illness. And we start to see the opening of what's called private madhouses. These are small scale institutions run by effectively entrepreneurs who have little to no medical qualifications. There are very few historical sources surviving about these institutions, but it's very clear that conditions in many of these institutions were barbaric. Inmates, which was the language used at the time, were treated like animals. They suffered abuse and violence. And this kind of period of history is often being termed as the trade in lunacy. Despite this, the late 18th century sees a rise in a number of other institutions. So they might not necessarily have centred on mental health, but certainly looked after people with mental health conditions. So jails, workhouses, and latterly subscription hospitals. These subscription hospitals were hospitals that were paid for by rich local people, and they were like charitable institutions. So for those of you local to York in this talk, Bevan Park Hospital will be familiar to many of you. Bevan Park started life as York Lunatic Asylum in 1777. However, as an institution, it was very early on tarred with horrible abuses that were happening there. So early on, we see the death of a Quaker woman called Hannah Mills, and a number of other abuses take place in this institution. Now, the discovery of these abuses led directly to the opening of the York Retreat, which is the picture pictured on the slides that you should be able to see there. The York Retreat, again, many of you may know this if you're York-based, was founded by William Tuke. It's opened in 1796. And I think it's fair to say that the history of this institution is quite literally world-leading. Some of you may have heard me talking about this on the radio yesterday. It's fair to say that Tuke was absolutely instrumental in changing mental health treatment for the better. So this institution is founded on humanitarian Quaker principles. Tuke was one of the first to believe that the mentally ill should not be chained up. Instead, he instigated a treatment of what was called at the time moral therapy. This puts religion and work at the heart of recovery. Now, when I say that this process, this practice was world leading, I do genuinely mean that. This stuff is happening in York and it's happening in Paris at the same time. And it changes the way that people believe in and understand mental illness. So all of this history then is a backstory to my talk in some way, but it feeds into what happens in the 19th century and how mental illness is perceived. So in many ways, the 19th century was an age of medical intervention. It's an age of institutions. We all know how the Victorians loved their institutions, and mental health care was absolutely no different. So the first legislation comes in 1808. It's a piece of legislation that's permissive. It allows county asylums to be built for the first time from ratepayers' money. However, because it's permissive, it doesn't make it compulsory. There isn't that much take-up to begin with. Some were built, but not too many. Again, those of you local to the area will probably know of Wakefield Asylum, which was one institution built during this time. The second piece of legislation, which is more important, is a twinned piece of legislation in 1845. It's a combination of the Lunacy Acts and the County Asylums Act. And basically what this does is it makes it compulsory that institutions are built. It also streamlines the process of admission and discharge. This legislation is heavily linked to the new poor law legislation, the legislation that we associate with workhouses, the Oliver Twist image. And I think this is one of the reasons why this legislation was so hated. To become an inmate after 1845 basically meant to become, for most patients, what was termed at the time, a pauper lunatic. Now, I think this is part of the issue of this stigma, is what many historians call the double disgrace of not only being a lunatic, but being a pauper as well. Now, it's this 1845 legislation that I want to focus on, as this dramatically increases asylum provision for the number of beds and number of patients admitted to these institutions. So to come back to our question then, at this stage, despite what is clearly unfortunate terminology, I think we can see this as a process, an attempt at care and cure. Perhaps a realization that society needs to help its sick members and look after them. So as you can see from this chart, hopefully it's big enough for you to see, the 1845 legislation makes a huge difference with regards to both the number of asylums and also the number of patients in them. What we see is that existing institutions get bigger and bigger. You can see before the 1845 legislation in 1827, there's only 9 county, borough and city asylums. There's only just over 1,000 people in these institutions, averaging out at just over 100 people per institution. What we can see, however, is a rapid and sustained growth in both the number of institutions, the number of county, borough and city asylums, but also the number of people within them. So it rises from just over 100 people in these institutions to almost 1,000 people in these institutions by the end of the century. Now, to see this in a chart is one thing. To see the ginormous rise on the graph of how the graph goes up, I think, is to see this monumental rise more clearly. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind throughout this talk. If, and I think they were, asylums had meant to be curative spaces, if they had intended to take after the ideas of William Tuke at the retreat, how can that level of therapeutic cure and care be maintained at these sheer numbers in these institutions? And so what we see in these two different figures, both the chart and the graph, is basically the same thing. We see the rise of institutions and the rise of the number of the mentally ill. However, that's not disputed. What's disputed is the interpretation that we put onto those facts. So I just want to share 2 historians with different viewpoints for you. So the first is Kathleen Jones. Kathleen Jones argues that this rise is a good thing. She argues that reform and enlightenment, basically the knowledge that there are mentally ill people out there that need cure, that need care, means that there's more people being treated. She claims that this is a good thing. It shows an increase within society that people are starting to care. Andrew Scull, however, argues the opposite. He argues that we need to be more suspicious of this, that it's too simplistic merely to see history in terms of progress and change. So I just want to think about that argument a little bit more. So Andrew Scull is a really famous historian who wrote this influential book, The Most Solitary of Afflictions. He's a sociologist, but he's also influenced in the work of anti-psychiatry and also Marx. And basically he comes up with 3 main ideas in this work. He argues that these asylums are what he refers to as museums of madness for the inconvenient. He claims that they're spaces to put people who won't and can't work, for people that are in the way in society. He argues that the 19th century is a time where capitalism is really developing, and in fact we need to now get rid of these people and take them out of the capitalist system. He argues that the asylum system is part of the increasing role of the state in monitoring its civilians. And he also talks about the concept of the professionalisation of mad doctoring. So he argues that this is a period where psychiatry becomes a thing, and it's all part of this professionalisation. Similarly, we see another historian, Irving Goffman, in 1961, wrote a really influential work called Asylums. And what he argues here is that these institutions are basically about labelling people. It's about labelling and othering people as being different, as perhaps not fitting into society. So with such a wild kind of interpretations, so many different interpretations of history. My question for you tonight is, well, what do we believe? What do you believe? So the rest of my talk is going to look at 3 different things to try and help us to come up with an answer to this question. We're going to have a think about who these people were and why they were sent to these institutions. I want us to think about what was life like there and what were the treatments like. So I thought I'd start here. Why were people sent to these institutions? And what's on the screen here is an excerpt from some asylum minutes from the year 1882. Now, some of these, if you can see these on your screen, they may look strange, they may look funny, some of them may look horror-inducing. I'm particularly concerned on this one for one that I've never seen before, and I've seen a lot of these, about the sedentary life and abuse of tea, because if that's not me during lockdown, I don't know what else would describe me. However, joking aside, I think we need to remember context here. I think context is king. We need to remember that these are real people. Each of these numbers on this screen consists of a real human being who is really living in the absolute abject poverty of the Industrial Revolution. For me, when I look at these numbers and when I look at these categorizations and causes, supposed causes, it says on the screen, these are people who had nowhere to turn. Remember, there's no welfare state in the 19th century. There's no safety net. The only space that these people had to turn was workhouses or the asylum. They may well have had no one to look after them. So just to read a few off the screen here: poverty, old age, intemperance, death of relatives. These are all characteristics that suggest to me that these people are nowhere else to go. They may not have been mentally ill. They may have been, they may not have been. Some of these, you look at this, breast cancer is not mental illness. Of course, it's not mental illness. However, the symptoms that might have been displayed might link into them. I'll go and show us in a second. For me, these are people who had nothing. Their situation or their family's situation had become too much for them to bear. And so because of this, they end up in an institution. Now, if you're anything like me, when I first kind of was struck by a table like that, I find it really hard to process. I find it very difficult to see the people behind the words, behind the numbers. And so what I thought would be helpful for us would be to look at just one individual case study. So this is from the admission registers. One of the things that I do a lot in my work is I try and figure out who's in these institutions, why are they there, what are they doing there? And the best way we can see that in the archives is to look at the admission registers. The 1845 legislation meant that all of these look the same. They've all got the same bits for the same people to write in about these people. So what I've copied onto the screen is basically an exact replica of how these look. I chose one case study at random for us to look at. We'll call her Mary. I've not given her her surname in order to protect her. And this is the record we get from Mary from the casebooks. And this is what we learn. We can learn quite a lot about her. So we learn that she's a housewife, that she's chargeable to Knaresborough, so she's coming from quite some distance. She's admitted on the 27th of July, 1900, and she's admitted to the West Riding Asylum in Menston. For those of you that don't know, that's kind of halfway between Leeds and Bradford. Each of the case notes then, the admission notes, have facts observed by a local doctor and usually some other facts, often by a family or friends. So the local doctor says of Mary that she's depressed of spirits, says someone's coming to hang her, that she sees fires of fire and brimstone in her room. She refuses food, refuses to answer questions, and says that she sees someone burying her child under the floor. Her family and friends, we don't know who in this record, comment that she threatened to drown herself and set off to do so, that she sees people coming with knives and ropes to attack her, and that every red coloured article she sees is fire and brimstone. We get a little bit more information from these case notes. So what we learn is that she's 21 years old, she's married, this is her first attack of insanity, and so she's never been in an institution before. She's only been insane for 10 days, and the supposed cause is family troubles. She's seen as not epileptic, not suicidal, and not dangerous. Now, to me, my alarm bells are already ringing, and I don't know if you've spotted this, but here we're hearing that she's not suicidal, whereas on the first page we see from her family and friends that she's threatened to drown herself and set off to do so. So to me, there's already a contention, there's already something wrong with these case notes. Either the hospital staff have not perceived her to be suicidal, or else her family have perhaps talked up her illness to make her seem a little bit more ill to try and get her care. These are answers to questions that we can't ever know, and the frustrating answers that sometimes keep me awake at night. However, this is one of the first problems. What we then see is we see an examination of Mary by the doctor in the institution. So when she gets to the institution, this is what the medical officers say. They say that she's got a very startled, bewildered look and keeps staring about her every now and again, fixing her eyes on some point of the room and appearing very frightened. So sudden noises seem to frighten her very much. She makes a moaning sound continually, but she will not speak and does not seem to understand much of what is said to her, for her expression does not change. She's suspicious of bystanders, especially when food is taken to her. She knows that she's only been here a few days, but no other information can be obtained. The diagnosis put forward is melancholia, which is a type of depression, and the cause here is lactation. Again, this leaves me with questions and more questions than answers. Lactation being breastfeeding, and the condition here that the supposed cause is family troubles, i.e. a well-known Victorian euphemism for pregnancy or childbirth or something around there, makes me wonder what has happened to this small child. Mary is very depressed. The cause is lactation, supposed to cause family troubles. And interestingly, if we go back to the start, the facts observed by the local doctor, she sees someone burying her child under the floor. This leads me to question what's happened here? What has happened to Mary? What has left her in this state? And of course, in the Victorian period, losing children was not uncommon. And it leads me to wonder whether this is some form of postnatal depression, whether perhaps there's something more involved here than that. And so to go back to our original chart here, if we saw family troubles there, we might roll our eyes. But looking into the stage and the condition of Mary, she would be down as family troubles, But actually we're starting to understand that there's maybe something much, much more severe and deep going on here. So this kind of links me to the role of the family then. And the case notes to me show that the role of the family is actually completely intrinsic in getting patients into these institutions. They're the people who they're the people who alert the authorities. They're the people who ask for help. They're the people who get the doctors to come to their relatives. Sometimes loved ones literally can't take their loved one's behaviour anymore and now know that they need help. So for me, it's not necessarily about getting rid of inconvenient people, as school was telling us earlier, but instead it's about a family trying to access and find help. John Walton has shown us that families are responsible for both casting out their loved ones, but also bringing them back into the family mould as well. And I think what we see from the role of casebooks is that families are very much at the forefront of what's happening, and that doctors are at the very end of this process. So my next question then was, well, what is life like inside the asylum? What's life like inside these institutions? And I think we need to remember how overcrowded they had become by the late 19th century. So of course, this depends very much on the patient, it depends on the institution, and it depends on the time period as well. Obviously, the 19th century is a very long time. But I think there's some generalizations that we can draw. There's a really strict, regimented daily routine, a time to get up, a time to go to bed, a time to eat meals, a time to work. There's set meal times, set meals. There's also very prescribed work activities. Religious services are a huge part of Victorian life, and so patients were made to go to religious services on a Sunday. There was some attempt to break up the monotony of asylum life. So there were often weekly dances or entertainments. In the summer, there were sporting events. So there was some attempt from staff to kind of try and make it a little bit more engaging and a little bit more fun. But it's questionable into how much that perhaps worked. There were, of course, some abuses of power and some exceptionally questionable treatments. We need to remember at this stage that in 1845, the lunacy commissioners basically meant that, the 1845 legislation created people called the lunacy commissioners, who the best way to see them, I think, is Ofsted today for schools, but they were the Ofsted of asylums at the time. They had some power. They could oversee these institutions, and they could and would name and shame institutions where things were going terribly wrong. They could and did have the power to end careers when such abuses were found out. So there is some accountability within these institutions, but again, it depends on the institution and it depends on the time. So as I mentioned earlier then, Tuke, when he set up the York Retreat, he came up with a new idea about how to treat mental illness. And his idea was called moral treatment. In essence, basically, it brought together work, religion, and treating people as if they're human beings. And of course, county asylums massively bought into this message, and they used all of these things, particularly the moral therapy and the work version of this, especially, I guess, as patients can be seen as cheap labour. So about 60% of the population were expected to work, and a patient's progress was often measured in this way. work was very much divided in gender division, so gendered. Women were expected to work in the laundry or on wards, whereas men had much more of a perhaps exciting role, perhaps not, working in the gardens, producing the food, working as joiners or carpenters or tailors, those types of jobs. Of course, this just marries up and matches exactly what's happening in Victorian society outside. I think there's two different ways to look at work and the use of work in these institutions. The first is that you could look at it as a type of hard labour. Is it a form of slave labour making these people do these things? Or could we perhaps see it as being therapeutic in some way? They're not exciting jobs, they're not nice jobs, but it does give some element of routine to an otherwise really boring life. It gives people something to do as they're getting better rather than just stay in bed. Certainly, the Lunacy Commissioners thought the latter. They say, of all the means employed for the alleviation and cure of insanity, none can stand in competition with actual labour, whether in or out of doors. So if work is one kind of treatment, then what are some of the other types of treatments? Again, just like life, this completely depends. It depends on the patient, it depends on the illness, it depends on the decade. So there's a whole host of things that's going on here. We've got to remember that in the 19th century, there's no real understanding of what mental illness was, or indeed how to treat it. So instead, what was tried was a series of what we could only refer to as experiments. There's a real focus on moral treatment and something called non-restraint. And sometimes when I look at the case notes, it's clear that some patients quite literally just need time or food or a space to relax. They quite literally need a place of sanctuary. Sometimes, however, this term non-restraint can't be taken as literally as I think we could be wished. They are accountable for excessive punishments and treatments. However, some of the early 19th century treatments, I don't think there's any way we can see them other than being completely barbaric. The one that I have nightmares about is the Whirling Chair, for instance, which I don't understand. I've seen the rationale for how it was supposed to cure people, but I don't understand how people would genuinely believe that might have worked. So some treatments are utterly barbaric, particularly in the early parts of the 19th century. However, other treatments are more insightful. They're perhaps variants of treatments in some guise that we might see today, such as hydrotherapy or early forms of light therapy. There's also a list of medicines that are used at the time. So some medicines we should put very firmly in inverted commas. So the use of arsenic for some time, I think, should perhaps be avoided. But they also used various medicines. Often wine was prescribed, sometimes food and diet was very much part of it. And so treatments is a dodgy one because it very much depends on who you are, what institution you're at, and what illness you've been diagnosed with. Let's return then to Mary for a second and finish Mary's story. So what we can see of the rest of Mary's story in her case books is that just a week after our mission, she's visited by the medical officer. He describes her as still being in quite a dazed state. She's in a bewildered condition and still refusing to speak. But she's not so restless and she's not requiring side room treatment. Now that's a euphemism for solitary confinement. She gets outside exercise and is taking her food. So in a week, she started to eat again. What we then see is that the medical officer basically comes to her once a month for the next few months, in which time we see a process of slow but steady improvement. You'll notice that there's a constant comment on her physical health. And I think that shows us just how somatic doctors thought these illnesses were. If you could improve someone's physical health, you might also be able to improve their mental health. By November, it's decided that she's made much improvement since her last night. She's much more rational, and so they send her out on trial for a bit. They don't just chuck people back out into the community, they give them like little trial periods. Her trial was successful and she's finally discharged in December. So Mary's story is a success story. It goes well for Mary. However, I think we need to remember that I've literally plucked one out of thin air to discuss with you tonight, and not all of these stories end well. In fact, the vast majority of them do not. I just want to turn and think for a second about treatments and ethical dilemmas when it comes to this type of history, really. And I apologise for the graphic nature of the picture on the screen, but I think it illustrates what I'm about to say quite nicely. So in terms of thinking about the ethical dilemmas that are faced by asylum doctors, they're faced by them every single day. I think it's fairly clear that most wanted to help their patients recover. Even if they didn't want to do it in an altruistic sense, if they could get their patients to recover, they'd be deemed the best quote unquote mad doctor, and that would be really good for their profession and their career. So I think it's very clear that they wanted their patients to recover. And I think it's very easy for us in the 21st century to basically criticise either way. So they don't know what works and what doesn't. I think it's very easy for us to criticise. So either they tried barbaric treatments and that was wrong, or they didn't do enough and that was wrong. And I think it's very easy for us to get lumbered into that hindsight contextual approach. An example that I want to showcase is the example of force feeding. Force feeding, quite rightly, gets a very negative press. It's painful, it's humiliating, it's degrading. It's often linked in our minds to the suffragettes on hunger strike in prison in the 20th century. But it was frequently used in asylums. So patients like Mary, for instance, who came to the institution not eating, who because of their illnesses were too sad, too depressed, too mad, too afraid to eat, was subjected to force feeding. And I think it's very easy again to be critical of this. But what's the alternative? The alternative would have been to have let these people die. And I think these are some of the kind of ethical dilemmas and conversations that we need to start to think about in order to kind of try and draw a picture of what's happening. Lastly then, in terms of getting out of the asylum, it's not great, I'll be honest. So Mary's is a positive story, but most stories are not positive. There's between a 35 to 50% cure rate. They don't know how to treat these illnesses, and most patients do not become cured. However, you don't have to be cured to leave the institution. So again, if families want to get their loved ones back out of the institution, they can. Doctors have no say to hold a patient without the consent of families or magistrates. And I think that's really important, because if these institutions were completely prisons, then maybe that would not have been the case. Similarly, the writers Mooney and Reynaz both basically reject the totality of the asylum system. They talk about the lunacy commissioners that come in and out to monitor what's happening. Visitors come in and out. Patients come in and out. So there's kind of a fluidity about these institutions that we need to remember. In terms of my conclusions then, just a few really. I'm going to let you draw your own conclusions, and maybe we can have a bit more of a chat in the questions in a second. I think it's very clear that there were loads and loads of scandals in institutions, both in the 18th and in the 19th century. The 19th century was supposed to bring about reform, and it did to some extent, but abuses and reform sit side by side in different institutions at the same time, sometimes in the same institution at the same time. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that asylums are horrid places, but there's also some evidence to suggest that they're progressive and that life was, for some people, better inside than outside for many patients. Again, remember the context of what's going on outside. And I suppose that's my final key point for us to draw from, that we really need to look at asylum treatment and the regime of the asylum from the historical perspective. From the perspective of this is what can happen when there's no welfare state, when there's no safety net, when there's no provision for people who are at the rock bottom. And so these institutions, they were the safety net, they were the provision for people. And I think we should judge them from their 19th century perspective rather than from a modern day perspective. I've put my email address at the end of the talk. I'm always happy to hear from people. So if you'd like to get in touch beyond just asking questions in the Q&A, I would be more than happy for you to drop me an email and get in touch with me. In fact, that'd be lovely. And so, yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. I really hope you enjoyed that, and I'll be interested to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, Alex. I think on behalf of the audience, I'd like to say it was a very fascinating talk, which raises many issues, I think, that we can now raise in Q&A. So there's a couple of questions on the Q&A board. So just again, if you're not used to this this format, if you hover your cursor over the Q&A arrow at the bottom of the screen, then you can click on it, then the question and answer board will come up. And we've got some coming through already. So starting from Cecile, how would you respond to Foucault's critique of Tuke's approach? Is the first question on the screen.
That's a really interesting one, Cecile. I like that. Foucault and Tuke, Foucault's basically his vision about the panopticon and the idea that Foucault basically links to anti-psychiatry, for those of you that don't know, and he wrote a particular piece of work called Madness and Civilization. I'm less familiar with Foucault's critique of Tuke's approach as I am familiar with historians' critique of Foucault's approach, which is to rather dodge the bullet, but I think I'm going to. Foucault is brilliant, and I've got a lot of time for Foucault, but he's a philosopher and he's not a historian. And his version of history is a little bit dodgy and not quite factually correct. And so lots of people, interesting though I think Foucault's ideas are, particularly around that area of the panopticon, I think Foucault is less well used by historians just on account of that, really, on account of the fact that his ideas are brilliant, but his perception of the history is perhaps a little bit off.
Okay, so as I say, I'll do a cross section as questions are coming through thick and fast. Another question here: many asylums are outside the town or the city. Was this to provide pleasant surroundings or to put them outside the community?
Now that is a wonderful question. That's a question that is frequently asked and pondered about. When you look into the sources, the idea was that it was about getting people into nature, and so the York Retreat, for instance, outside the city, in nature, in the countryside, some beautiful images of the retreat. So That was what they claimed at the time. It does, however, very conveniently, like you say, get rid of all of these people outside of the city. So that's a big argument. If you take the sources at face value, then the argument is that it is absolutely about pleasant surroundings. If you want to be more critical, take a Foucauldian approach or an Andrew Scull approach, then the argument is it's getting people outside. My argument is that by the later 19th century, again, it changes across the 19th century, but by the late 19th century, these are the spaces where they've got the most room because they know they're going to need to build a really big institution. So I think pragmatism might feed into that as well.
Okay, another question. Do you have any information about the number of people admitted to asylums with syphilis when they reach the terminal stage?
I mean, I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but it was called general paralysis of the insane. So tertiary stage syphilis became known as general paralysis of the insane, and it is a lot. They figured out when they figured out how to treat it, but that's a story in itself, which I don't think I have time to go into. But it is a lot of people.
Yeah. Another one. Thank you for the interesting talk. And says that the reasons for admission may seem ludicrous to us now, but if we consider a stress vulnerability model, many of the reasons are very valid, aren't they? We all have a level of stress above which we suffer mental distress, no matter the cause of this stress.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's exactly what I wanted to say. So yes, you've got my point perfectly. I think when these crop up on social media, as they do from time to time, they get ridiculed. And as I tried to point out with my case study of Mary, if we just saw family trouble, we might roll our eyes. But when we look into Mary, this is a person who absolutely, as you're saying, with stress vulnerability module, she's reached the end of her tether. She's clearly suffering. And I think, you know, they may seem ludicrous, but they're all causes, they're all reasons for people who can't continue with the level of stress or anxiety or suffering or illness in their lives. So yes, absolutely, I completely agree.
And another one, asking how bad a condition do people have to be in to have had electric shock treatment?
That's a really interesting question. Again, it depends on the time and it depends on the institution, but actually not that bad often. So I have come across cases where electric therapy, as it was called at the time, was used on outpatients in the 1900s. So if they're not ill enough to be committed, but are outpatients, so they're returning in and out of the institution, I would say not very ill at all.
Yeah. And another one, can you say more about the evidence that life was better inside than out?
Again, I think that varies on the patient, absolutely varies on the patient. But in case notes, and this is more anecdotal evidence than real evidence perhaps, but in those admission registers that I've shown you for many people, we see lots of people suffering from lots of conditions. We see people who are attempting to take their own lives. We see people who are being attacked by their husband or their wife sometimes. So abused. We see people in fairly horrific situations who, when the authorities are called, take those people out of those situations. So particularly for the women and men, I've seen both, who were suffering from abuse at the hands of their partner, I actually think that being in an institution for a little while and maybe finding a clean break of it outside might be better for them. For those of them that are trying to take their own lives, then the institution might be able to stop that in a way that a family member might not be able to do. For people who, and you see many elderly people in these institutions, since the question about care homes, loads of elderly people in these institutions, and they've got no one to look after them outside often. There's no one to cook the meals, there's no one to look after them. The institution does at least give them a roof, some fires, some food. And in the context of the 19th century, this is more than a lot of people have. So anecdotal evidence perhaps, but I think for some patients, it is better.
Yeah, so we've got time for one or two more. Question here, when were frontal lobotomies carried out and why?
Long after the 19th century, and I should know this off the top of my head, and I don't. I'm loving these questions. I'm getting some really hardcore questions, aren't I? The answer to that is that I'm not even going to make it up and lie. I don't know. I'm really sorry. I should know. Google it.
And I think it's time for one more. How many institutions were there in England by the end of the 19th century?
I think this is going on to 100. I think it just tips over 100 by into the 20th century. So quite a few of them. I think it's on my graph actually. Let me see. 77 says my own table, so I'm going to go with 77.
You're standing up for that one. Okay, that's. Were people free to discharge themselves? Interesting question.
Not in the 19th century. So by the time the 1930s came round, if they'd been admitted as a voluntary patient, then they could discharge themselves. In the 19th century, they were not able to do that. And I do agree with you. I do think that's a huge problem. So if the domestic abuse case, which is stated there, is part of this, then they would have to also, they wouldn't just, it's not a sanctuary, it's not a refuge like that. They'd have to be exhibiting mental health symptoms because of their abuse. And then presumably, not necessarily, but if you take them away from that abuse, then maybe slowly they'll start to get better. And when they started to get better, then the authorities would look into discharging them. But no, they weren't free to discharge themselves until 1930.
Okay, and so we just pushed past the time, but one actual practical question for you as a researcher. Is there a way of tracking down a family member's hospital notes?
Do you know what? I get asked this question so many times, and I'm going to try and put in to do a workshop with family members. Certainly when I came off Who Do You Think You Are, I had loads of people get in touch with me to say something similar. I had somebody in my family. By the early 80s, I'm assuming you mean in the 1980s there. So yes, there should be. If you know what institution they were at, then you can find out on the National Archives website where those archives are held. So that's frequently what I do. When I was looking for David Williams' grandfather, I knew the institution. I looked to find the archive where that's held. I've never myself looked at records that are as late as the 1980s. I've only really looked up to the 1930s and 1940s. There's a 100-year case closure limit on looking at the files that I look at. So you either need express permission from your university to look at this, or else you need to be a family member and prove that you're a family member. And that way they'll allow you access to those records. I'd say give it a go. Ask archivists. They get asked questions like this all the time. And if you're interested, if you're intrigued, go onto the National Archives, see if you can find where those records are held, and then just ring up your local archivist and will try and do everything they can to help you.
Okay, well, we've overrun, so I don't think I've got through quite all the questions, so apologies if I haven't. As we said, so Alice is available to continue dialogues via email, which is made available to everyone. So I think it's just Alice calls up the relevant slide. There we go. Yeah. And so it just remains for me to, I think on behalf of everyone, to thank Alice for a fascinating and wonderful talk, tremendously thought-provoking, and I think we will take away many new perspectives from this paper.